Well, welcome everybody. I wanted just to start off by reminding you that we have a community, an online community at the Night Science Institute's website. And if you go to night-science.org, like it says, no, over there. Sorry, I'm not good at mirrors. Then you can you look for the community button and then link at the top, and then we have in there a discussion around the book club. We have a so-called category for the book club, and there is a discussion around the knowledge machine there as well. So if you want to continue the conversation there, or link some of your colleagues and friends to there, they can see the upcoming events as well. So I'm super excited. Today we are talking about the Iron Rule at Oh, Alexander's coming back in. The Iron Rule, which is kind of at the heart of this book, The Knowledge Machine by Michael Strevens. Does anybody want to start us off by telling us what is the Iron Rule? Please feel free to unmute and jump in. It's supposed to be interactive. It's not a lecture, guys. It's a book club.
I'm looking for the page.
In the US paperback, it's page 96, so I can help you with that.
Okay. Um, it is what does he call it? I think he calls it um, it's iron rule, but it's also very weak in the sense that it's only just it's very yeah it only entails a small part of the whole process, but yet sort of encapsulates everything that you need. So an argument should be settled by empirical testing, or even all arguments should be settled by empirical testing. And such an empirical test should be conducted to decide between a pair of hypotheses. And that can be an experiment or a measurement. And you should design that experiment or measurement as such that it has a set of outcomes. And one of the possible outcomes allows you to distinguish between hypothesis A and hypothesis B.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. Seems incredibly simple. Does that sound familiar to people? Is that
I don't know if I can jump in quickly or I don't know,
please?
guess kind of, but I sort of read about it a little this morning, but it's kind of what it leaves out, right? Which is like aesthetics, philosophy, religion, just other aspects of life in general, might apply for the iron rule, at least from my perspective. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's in Strevens's core hypothesis is that the reason science suddenly was able to really explain the natural world, maybe starting 200, 300 years ago from the Enlightenment on, is that we discarded all these other things, right? We discarded what was considered important, for example, amongst the ancient Greek philosophers and scientists, right? That a hypothesis not only explain something about the world, but also be beautiful and aesthetic and maybe harmonize with religious concepts or other views of the cosmos. And what Strevens says is nonsense. You can keep all that. Don't in fact don't even bring it up, right? Don't bring anything up except empirical testing, right? Empirical data, and so that is really, yeah. So in the context of night science and day science, right? We would associate the iron rule with day science, right? The visible part of science, the hypothesis testing, hypothesis falsification. Um, so let me just ask: does this iron rule? Do you feel the iron rule? Do you feel like that's, as a scientist, that's the rule you live by?
I feel like a lot of time is also spent on interpreting data itself, which I think that I mean, it's inherently part of this iron rule, but isn't exactly described as much, at least in from what I remember reading.
Yeah, very interesting point. And last session we talked about the beginning chapters of the book where Strevens talks about human frailty, right? And the fact that we are loaded with filters and biases and our own cultural and sort of social baggage, if you will. So he actually makes the point in that we struggle to apply the iron rule because we become attached to hypotheses. We become and he tells the story that we talked about last time of Eddington testing the gravitational theories of Newton and Einstein. Does anybody remember that part of the book or what we talked about?
Yeah.
Can you give us a quick recap?
I mean, I guess it was, yeah, I mean, the moral of the story was that a scientist can be biased due to maybe a personal belief system or investments made to conduct the experiment. And that I think in the Eddington experiment, they chose to discard one of the two telescopes or measurements in order to, yeah, make a case for a certain hypothesis.
Exactly. So
Uh,
that's one of go ahead, sorry.
So yeah, I was about to say that I think the whole what Stevens makes is quite nice that you sort of decouple interpretation from observation by saying this second axiom where all public discourse is only based on whatever you observe, and then all private discourse in science can be this interpretation. I feel like it's a nice way to get out of this whole
Yeah, and
interpretation debacle.
exactly. That was going to be my first question to everyone. That demarcation that you just pointed to, is that how you also experience your lives as scientists? In other words, do you have different rules when you're writing a paper or giving a formal presentation at a conference versus whether you're talking to your research group colleagues, in a lab meeting or at lunch or wherever?
Yeah, I can say definitely from my perspective, that's the case. I'm not in the same room as everyone else over there, so I figured I could jump in and say it definitely governs it in such a way that creates boundaries that are fun to push on, I would say. For me, using night science, if we're gonna contextualize it with that. So a lot of the times you'll find errors in the way that day science restricts language, right? Or restricts the way that we can talk about certain concepts just because of the form, right? So I think if you can incorporate that into a form that takes some level of sort of maybe a blend of night and day science, when maybe the dawns and the dusk, the borders of the day and night science, right? So that's kind of my perspective, but it's frustrating sometimes because sometimes you just want to say what is in front of your eyes is the reality. But you need to have a heat map, you need to have a volcano plot, and you'll need to be able to explain the p-value. And it's like, I can see it with my eyes, and we're missing something huge here with volcano plots, for example. Like dysregulation of a system might happen with something very tiny, with a tiny shift, not a low p-value, depending on the context. So I think night science gives us the concept for like kind of the how to contextualize day science, maybe. But I don't know, how do people feel about like respect of night science for day science is kind of the other question here, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
where do those borders end?
Yeah, so Jackie, let me congratulate you. Despite having thought about this stuff for a long time, I've never thought of dusk or dawn science. I think you've opened up a whole new area of thought and investigation. It's interesting. It's really interesting. Others, please chime in, reactions to what Jackie said. Yeah, so I think I would agree with you, Jackie. We would map the sort of private and official spheres that Strevens points out very much to the night and day signs, right? And I think that's certainly how I experienced science when I was still, actively doing research. That you would talk one way in one, we call it code switching, right? You would use different ways, but you're blocking off. You're correct. We would also say that you're blocking off a lot of intuitive thinking power by restricting yourself to the sort of strict day science. So one of the points that Strevens makes is because the iron rule sort of urges us to discard anything except the empirical data and their strict interpretation. Yes, there is a certain. I would agree with the gentleman in the red shirt that there is interpretation, and that has some risks to it. And in fact, I think we'll probably talk about that next session. But later on in the book, Michael Strevens likens scientists to polyps on a reef, which is one of my favorite metaphors that he uses. So he makes the point that scientists are like polyps on a reef. They have soft, squishy bodies, which is their interpretation and hypothesizing and their thinking, and that decays when they're dead, but they leave behind a calcified residue of data and methodology that it has permanence and builds on the edifice of science, right? So the interpretation is there, but it may not last, right? It is the right of, I guess, of every generation to take the data from the previous generation and reinterpret it, maybe using different tools or different mental models or different hypotheses, right? So coming back to the sort of the iron rule, this irrationality that Strevens described, what are the principal benefits and potential drawbacks of this idea that he describes of this disciplined tunnel vision, what we might call extreme day science? What are the pluses and minuses? Jackie, you kind of alluded to one thing, which is that you feel when you're talking to your colleagues and you were saying, I can see the picture, you were being, if I interpreted what you said correctly, you were being pointed to the need to furnish empirical data.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the times the boundaries that we draw between night and day science can end up bleeding into day science in a way that we don't fully grasp. And you kind of have it in your icon, or the logo for night science, right? There's stricter boundaries, there's not as dispersed groups. In reality, if you were to look at how these boundaries are dictated or discerned, right, it's based off of those little not connected stars, pieces of data. So I think when those calcifications happen, you lose the context of the time and how people were talking about science, approaching science. You can see like in the 70s, a lot of the ideas that I know about at least are sort of addressed already. And you kind of look back and you're like, oh, that's funny. And now I'm using a different tool to answer the same question. But there's where your sort of issue is, or my issue is like we can have this technological advance as much as we want to and make the jargon as technical as we want to. But at the end of the day, common sense is going to dictate certain things. You can tell me that coffee is good for me, coffee is bad for me, but at the end of the day, how does coffee feel to me is going to matter. And so I love that the logo is really great for this visually, right? Because you can kind of see how those bounds go away. At some point, there's a different context, there's a different conditionality about how people truly operate. So I think there's that downside. The benefit is, right, but I feel we've leaned too far into it, is language is like if we share language and we share definitions, then we can communicate faster, better, more with more accuracy, right? Or maybe more precision, depending on the context again, maybe between each other. But then we step into another field, even like as an immunologist, step into a neuroscience room, talk about memory, both get confused, realize, wait, this is a shared trait. That's for night science, I guess. That's a limitation and a benefit. You can know where to place that. But I think that the restrictions are a lot at this point with the amount of tools that we have.
Interesting. Anyone else care to respond or?
Yes, I have another question. Like, how do people feel about big data and how we view it? Like, how we view its utility, how we view collecting more, how we view access, and what that means for how we interpret it. Kind of going back a couple of questions, I think, but
Mhm.
what does that mean? Because I struggle with big data sometimes where I'm like, hey, we don't need to run this massive data like thing for this particular question. At least let us use some of this data for other things that it's measuring. But you get to these points where you're asking, what about the data is actually important? Should I use this tool for every single data set, or use this perspective for every single data set, and what's acceptable, what's not? I think I got a little off topic there, but I'm just curious to know how people feel, how that manifests in interpretation and acceptance.
Sorry if I can jump in. I don't have an answer for you, Jake. I think that the question is very interesting, also related to the question I asked Oliver about what are the drawbacks of the iron rule, because I think that I don't know, but I think that one of the drawbacks could be that this very strict approach could isolate even further hypotheses, because I think it's touched at the end of the chapter that in the end you need an interpretation. You need to agree on how to interpret the data, the empirical data that you collect. And if you either decide on a hypothesis A or B, is really dependent on how you use the data you collected and where these data are driving you to which hypothesis. And I also have the question, what if you cannot collect any more data? Like in the case of the eclipse, for example, how do you drive your conclusions based on the things that you have and cannot enrich, for example?
Yeah.
Sorry, it's another question.
No, I think excellent points. Excellent points. Anyone else on Jackie's big data question? I was born after the era of big data, so I only had medium-sized data. I never had to contend with. But I think we have a lot of computational folks in the room, right? Who probably live and swim in big data from morning till evening. So thoughts from you guys.
Yeah, I think especially in the context maybe of this of the iron rule and of the work of Stevens, I feel like the main driver there for big data could be the generation of new hypotheses. So the idea that if you just generate enough like heaps of data that you then somehow try to analyze through some methods that are suited for that, you might be able to find some things that you just haven't thought about first, or that you see and that you think, hey, this is weird, this is not in line with what we were expecting in general. So not necessarily hypothesis driven between one or another hypothesis, but just stirring the pot and see what we find in a way. And I think that is in that sense it can be useful for that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, definitely a data exploration kind of mode, right? Which we think is an important element of night science, the willingness to live, to inhabit the data and to sort of live with it. And, that is somewhat frowned upon by strict adherents of the sort of the Popperian theory of, falsifying a hypothesis. And, the idea that you can noodle around in data and see what you can see, find the gorilla, as Itai and Martin would say, is a bit antithetical to the, I have a question, I have designed an experiment that will test these, the two hypotheses or whatever, and then I will analyze the data within that framework only. Yeah. But I like the idea that you can't have, right? So you can't have, there is no interpretation of data without human frailty, right? Without the frailty of the scientist that we talked about before, right? Maybe AI will solve this for us, maybe, or I don't know if solving is the right word. Maybe AI will take it away from us. But
can I ask what you mean by like frailty of the human? Because I didn't actually read the book. I'll be honest, I didn't have time. I just found out this book club yesterday, but I was curious to know what that means.
Yeah, it's what Strevens starts with. So the first few chapters are about that. It's the Eddington experiment that we talked about, right? The fact that it wasn't really an experiment, an observational study, right? It was the idea that we cannot actually be strict adherence to Karl Popper's idea of, just letting the hypothesis die, right? Because, oftentimes we've invested a huge amount of our time and our lives and our energy and our love and passion into a particular area of science. And then for someone to come along and say, well, that's all rubbish, it's really hard, right? Which is why we have orthodoxies. Which brings me to the next question. So the other concept in this part of the book is, or one of the other concepts is this idea of Baconian convergence, right? This idea that don't worry, it doesn't matter that, people have different views of the universe. Over time, empirical testing will inevitably lead to a convergence of viewpoints onto, quote, the truth. Strevin says it could be very noisy at the beginning, but then it inevitably comes down to how does that harmonize with the observed persistence of scientific disagreements and controversies that we have in different fields? Or maybe you don't see it that way. Maybe you feel there are no big controversies left in your field. I don't know. I'd love to hear your comments. I mean, is Baconian convergence something you see in your areas? Is that something that seems like a real thing?
I think one of the other things he also in this context wrote about that I think I see a lot is of this crowding out of positive evidence towards versus negative evidence, or like evidence towards, I mean, what I guess what you would consider in the long run the truth versus evidence that might have been made on errors or on methodological mistakes or stuff like that. Because I think in computational sphere there's a lot of that going on every once in a while, where someone might have some contradicting results on something, and then you can eventually get back to the methodological error, and then over the long run, I guess this averages out in the sense that, well, assuming most people do the right thing, you will find the most evidence towards the truth. I think that's something that, yeah, I've seen quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. So in the United States, particularly at the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, right, there's a huge emphasis right now on what they call rigor and reproducibility, right? So the so-called reproducibility crisis, has shaken biomedicine at least, right? I don't know if you have the same experience. I'm seeing some nodding, right? So should we just not worry about that because of the Baconian convergence? Is that just the noise that we're experiencing? Doesn't matter that you do the same study, that I do, and we don't get the same result. Doesn't matter because over the next period of time, we will nevertheless converge.
Well, I think it would still be important to be able to do the same study in the first place. So in what the field that I'm working in, and what I see a lot is that sometimes you just don't have the details necessary to re-implement the original work, and then you get into trouble because then you cannot even, you're not sure if you can compare at all.
Yeah. Another favorite book of mine, and I don't know if any of you read it, is called Rigor Mortis. Have you heard of this book? It's about the reproducibility crisis, and it talks a lot about Ioannidis' observations, but it also, just very germane to what you just said, describes the study that Amgen did. I forget, to me, 10 or 15 years ago. So Amgen spent a significant amount of money on what they did is they picked, I don't remember exactly, 200 of the, quote, most important cancer papers, studies in the previous decade. And then they tried to reproduce them. And they start off by writing to the investigators and saying, can you send me your cell lines? Can you send me your mouse models? And many of the papers didn't have anywhere near the detail in the methods section for them to actually reproduce it, right? So can you send me the protocols? And a lot of them weren't able to or chose not to. But then there were a certain number, maybe about half or so, 40% maybe, where they were actually able to get, quote, everything. And then they tried to repeat the experiment, and the success rate was very low. So I agree with you. A lot of thing that worries me about, AI being pointed at the scientific literature is that the juicy parts that AI will consume are the human interpretations, right? They're not the residue of the coral polyps, right? That's the data and the methodology. But if you have incompletely described data and under-described methodology, how will you actually know what was done, right?
I know I see it in my field of immunology. It's across species. That wasn't my original field, but what I probably focused on most, just the jargon, the level of contextuality required. I can say like there's an example of global integrin activation, and even that's a language thing where I should be able to know from context what global means here, right? But when I asked several people within the integrin field, which is not big field as far as I'm aware in immunology, right? They weren't sure what the context was. So my question is, even in there, is there how discrete are these subcategories that need to converge for this to make any sense fully? And that doesn't necessarily mean that that application of the Baconian, like, I guess, process is wrong or bad or not applicable. It just maybe could be interpreted in a different way, interpreted as needing a heavier weight on interaction between groups now that we have so many groups. I don't know if other people feel this way at all, but that's kind of my question about big data. I love having data. I could parse through data. If I could get paid to just parse through heat maps and have fun with ontology, I would. But at the end of the day, some of the questions I have is it feels like collecting that data becomes more important than understanding why we're collecting that data or what we could potentially discover from that data, because it gets pretty myopic. And I guess one of the fears, right, is having false idols, having false notions. I'm sorry, that's more of the philosophical end of it, but like if you have a hierarchical system of knowledge, that's going to change interpretations of what is valid and what is not, even as close to something like a word, like global activation.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It makes me even more worried about LLMs because they're consuming language, right? They're not consuming the science ultimately. They're consuming a human interpretation and representation of it, which has just no end of biases. No matter how day sciencey you try to write your papers, you're still going to tip your hand about what you really think is going on.
Well, and people use AI for like emotional things at this point. Like, how do I write an apology is something I've heard, kids do. I mentor some kids, high school kids, but they rely on it to an extent that um, not as concerning, but I guess as like a human who's living, who I guess, wants other people to enjoy science and the interest of science. It's kind of like anti-exploratory to some extent, and it's kind of hard when you start to think about how people can apply tone just to minor things. You don't really know how that aggregates into the day science boundary systems, right? So I'd also be curious to know your guys' opinion on that, because like I don't have a problem with big data at all. It's more about resource allocation in that regard and how we use our tools, who uses them, what do we use them on, and how do we understand how to use them more maybe efficiently together while also getting these hypotheses, like kind of maybe addressing the issues, the methods that you're talking about that are rigorous and very constrained.
I look to the data scientists in the room.
Or do any of you have any complaints with like scientists who are not data scientists like myself, that you would like wish me to impart to others? Because I think that's what I'm trying to sort of poke at here, in my own silly immunologist way. But I've had to learn some data science, and it's been a challenge to understand where the line is for someone like me in immunology with all these jargon terms and predetermined pathways and things like this.
It's an interesting question, a little bit outside of what we're talking about. I mean, we would probably in the night science world say that importing and exporting of ideas and expertise between fields is a potential source of power, right, and creativity. And there are people who believe that if you want to, if there are some very smart scientists who move into other fields and intentionally do not learn very much about these new fields, so as not to be bathed in the orthodoxy and the sort of conventions of the thinking in that field, which they feel would hamper their creativity. So not sure that's universally beloved, or if they ever get a grant funded, ever make it through a study section. I doubt it because of the tribal nature of science. But let me ask another question. So Strevens in this section of the book describes Isaac Newton as what he calls perhaps the first truly modern scientist. Why?
I didn't really read the last 20-ish pages of the book where he talks about that, but from what I know about Isaac Newton, I guess he was one of the first scientists that really separated kind of empirical studies from everything else, like we previously mentioned. So he kind of already started writing about and thinking about this sort of iron rule mode of thinking in a way.
Yeah, he had this motto. Anybody speak Latin? Hypotheses non fingo is the Latin version. I took Latin in high school because I had to, but I don't remember any of it. So I rely on the translation that Strevens provides, which is, I do not feign hypotheses. And what he meant by that was, I observe and I create, equations and theories and models that explain the world, the universe, perhaps. But I don't care what the hypothesis is, right? He was, I mean, he could never have gotten an NIH grant, that's for sure, with an attitude like that. So let me just so if you're interested in that particular question, I can highly recommend an episode of the Night Science podcast. Are there any listeners in the room? Anyone here listen to the podcast? Yeah, a couple of people. So if you haven't yet, Isaac Newton himself was a guest on the podcast back in 2024, episode 55. And Itai and Martin talk to him about this particular issue, and of course he's being channeled by Michael Strevens, right, whose book we're talking about. So this is Strevens pretending to be Newton. It's really quite amusing. It's kind of well done, I think, but well worth a listen the next time you have a few moments and are interested. It's only half an hour. It's definitely a fun thing, yeah. So I think Newton kind of exemplifies this iron rule type scientist, and I wonder how does that fit with your view of yourself as a scientist? Do you feel it's really important to have a hypothesis? Do you really feel that, is that how you see yourself? Are you? I'm curious, just as you make your way in the fields that you work in.
I like this this passage on Bacon where he sort of tells you to let go of any preconceived notions or biases or hypotheses and sort of be very neutral and clean or innocent or something as he calls it in the book. Because I feel like if I have a strong hypothesis already, then the experiments I might conduct, this human frailty comes into play then, or this bias comes into play again. But I suppose maybe here hypothesis is more like broader, maybe philosophy of nature kind of thing when Newton was discussing gravity. But yeah, for at least on a smaller scale, I might feel that hypotheses can be biasing.
Yeah, you should get the T-shirt. A hypothesis is a liability. You can pick it up in our merch shop and support the Night Science Institute. So this is the end of the commercial break that we just enjoyed, but it just made me think of that. I love that T-shirt because hypothesis can be a liability. Totally agree. I totally agree. How about others? I mean, if I was to ask you, what is the question you're trying to answer in your science? How would you answer that question? Would you tell me about a problem? Would you tell me about a hypothesis? And especially if I wasn't a scientist or I don't know anything about your area of science, so you have to explain it in a way that a lay person can understand. Anyone?
I I thought about how I would explain it, and I think I in the past have explained it mostly through concepts. Like I'm interested in these two, or I'm curious about these two things, but I don't really necessarily or interested in this interaction. But there's never really like a strict hypothesis, I would say, that I'd be like, well, I think that this causes this, which causes this. It's more like I'm interested in properties and the way those interact in these two or four or five, whatever you want to say, domains. Um, and there's lots of reasons why that can be. There's a why behind that that's different. I think that's unique to everyone. So I don't know how that fits into all of this, but it's never a strict hypothesis. I'm curious to know if other people do describe it that way.
I think if I have to describe what I'm like doing or whatever to people, especially more in lay terms, I think it's just much easier to speak in terms of problems that you're trying to solve and that you're looking at, because I think globally speaking that describes a bigger picture. But when I think more of very specific problems, I think at some point you have to start somewhere. And I guess you could fit that in a form of hypothesis where you say, I do think in this direction sometimes, where I'm like, well, I think this could be a good solution to the problem. And then you start to implement that said solution because I mean, yeah, you got to do something, and then sometimes you find out that it doesn't work at all. And then okay, well, you have to be able to let go of that, then of course at some point. So maybe it's more of a notion of like a gut feeling. You could argue of like, well, this is, I think this would go into the right direction. But yeah, I mean, of course, there's a danger to that you keep working into the wrong direction for too long. So you have to, especially when you're starting out with something like that, be very quick in a way to sort of let go of that notion as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very, very interesting way of describing it, right? Um, I mean, I suspect that we make a big deal about hypotheses, but maybe that doesn't really enter so much into our day-to-day lives as scientists, right? Maybe we don't wake up in the morning with this big, question. We're much more in the process, in the pathway.
Yeah, I feel like it also relates a bit to, I think in the night science papers, they also had this pyramid where you start with an hypothesis, ID, intuition, and then you explore one path and then you explore another. And then kind of in the paper, you have this, you only represent one path in this whole tree and you say, this was my hypothesis and it always been my hypothesis. Whereas kind of like, if I'm true to myself, kind of that was not my actual hypothesis to begin with, but it's just a good story kind of to tell and it fits. It's an easy story to tell maybe. Um, Kind of relating a bit to what you're saying with the NIH grants, kind of like science is also maybe in its current form also a bit storytelling kind of, and you have to tell an appealing, easy to grasp, make sense, aligns with hypothesis kind of story, which is not always kind of exactly the hard stuff, the hard shell kind of. It's maybe a bit more toward much leaning towards the squishy
Yeah.
parts of it.
Yeah, I mean, Peter Medalla published a paper in the 50s, I think, calling scientific papers a fraud because of what you just said, which is that they're post hoc reconstructions of an intellectual journey that never took place, right? But that's the way you get your paper into Cell Science and Nature by, quote, like you just said, telling a good story. Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think that's another reason for concern because AI can't tell the difference between a scientist really, really pushing hard on their limited data set to make the most magnificent interpretation in order to get fame and glory with really the residue of the calcified residue. Yeah. I think that's a really good point. Yeah. So Strevens has another concept in this part of the book called the explanatory or. And so he talks about this as the sort of, we would call it the stuff of night science, right? Which is the material that sits between, well, in his idiom, it's what the iron rule forges, right? It's both data, but it's also interpretation. Um, and anybody have any reactions to that idea that if you came across it? It's a little bit abstract. I think for me, it certainly resonated with this idea that Jacob has about he calls night science the workshop of the possible, right? So it's also a kind of a process of manipulating material. It's a very sort of artists or artisans view of science, right? Of forging data into stories maybe and into answers. But yeah. So go ahead.
Oh, I was just curious about that because I really like that idea of the or because it's kind of mixing those maybe old sort of uh calcified bits into something new. It's kind of magical. And I think maybe that's the magic of that also night science aspect and kind of feeds into the authenticity of a story. If you're always in that mindset, even when you're working within bounds, right? Like I don't know if that's the or part, but maybe, we can sort of be more authentic in our storytelling if we think that way and mindset pretty much regularly and think of it as a story, not post hoc or ad hoc, but maybe while we're actually doing it, if we can work in those confines. I don't really know what those confinements are, conditions are, but I'm sure there are ways.
Yeah. So Itai and Martin did review the book, The Knowledge Machine, and they note that Strevin seems to overlook what they call the supreme pleasure of finding things out, a sentiment famously expressed by Richard Feynman. Right. So Strevins kind of presents the science probably with a strong bent towards day science, which perhaps not surprising because the iron rule is very much in that domain. But I wonder how that resonates with you. How does the sort of intrinsic enjoyment and curiosity, how does that mesh with your work, right? So I will put it to you. I'll put forward a hypothesis. Most people get into science not because they love writing grants and getting papers rejected, or holding lab meetings or whatever, but because they want to enjoy an intellectually satisfying, curiosity-driven discovery life, right? Career, work. Um, but we're just supposed to just apply the iron rule.
There was one example in the book of an application of the iron rule. I think it was hypothetical about heat being a kinetic force or being caloric fluid. And then these two scientists set up a room which was artificially made a vacuum with a glass pane in the middle, and then heat was transmitted through this glass. And kinetic force shouldn't be really this glass shouldn't really interfere with kinetic force, but should with caloric fluid. And then afterwards, uh, the experiment came through, and then they both found reasons why their hypothesis would still work. So they had to rule out more assumptions. And both in the setup of that experiment, and then also the reasoning behind why the hypothesis did or did not work, there's so much creativity and freedom there, that it's still built around this framework of the iron rule, but this allows for an enormous explosion of intellectual discourse. So I feel that the iron rule does not limit my enjoyment of that part of science for sure.
Well, first of all, I'm extremely glad to hear that, and I think you're absolutely right. That's interesting. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Anyone
I think
else?
also I think also you can't even apply the iron rule if you don't have hypotheses to begin with. And so to come up with hypotheses, there either has to be some sort of societal interest or just curiosity. And I guess historically it's often been curiosity. So I think the iron rule doesn't really work in some sort of isolation. You need hypotheses first to actually try to confirm them. And when you want to explain something that, yeah, that comes from some sort of motivation, whether intrinsic or extrinsic.
Yeah, and I mean, Night Science completely agrees with that, right? We think the pendulum has swung too far in favor of day science and the iron rule and empirical testing, and it potentially squeezes out some of the joy. And I think part of the reason science is somewhat of a crisis at the moment is that we have lost sight of that, right? And a lot of people who became scientists because they wanted to have that kind of a career or that kind of a working life are disappointed. My perspective. What does it prove me I'm wrong? I'll sit at that table on the college campus. Anyone?
But I think also that adding what you've just said, Oliver, I think that also part of enjoying science also lies on the fact that maybe you should also embrace the fact that you might not maybe really reach a great discovery. I mean, maybe you spend all your lives doing experiments and writing papers and discussing with other people without really having to grasp something solid. I mean, something that truly convinces you that you empower the human knowledge even further. And I think that maybe part of the enjoyment is something that I think it's depicted also at the beginning of the book, where you have people who become scientists because they love arguing with each other. I mean, because they are so fixated on details and on demonstrating things that they love the overall process of creating data, creating additional problems on the problems that they are discussing. And I think also that part of being scientist, part of the enjoyment of being a scientist is also feeling part of a community. Because if you were on your own running your experiment like a silly person in the backyard, and you are constantly talking to yourself only, I think that there's not much purpose on that. I think that part of the purpose of becoming scientist is to thrive within a community and try to contribute also with other people.
Yeah, thank you for that, Eleanor. I wonder, how do you think that the people you discussed who are maybe never make the big breakthrough, right? They don't make, the prize-winning discovery. Are they still contributing to the Baconian convergence? Are they still applying the iron rule and ultimately causing some hypotheses to be discarded?
Yeah, I think so. My field is mostly on super resolution microscopy, so I think that the field is quite interesting because you have a lot of scientists that develop a lot of new technology. So I think that they are still contributing to create sort of breakthroughs in their fields. At the same time, I really relate with what Jackie was asking before, meaning what this technology answers to. I mean, what are the questions that this technology that you are creating with this data that you are collecting are really, how these technology and data are serving the biological undiscovered areas in other fields. No, that's why I think that night science is so relevant, because you really need to meet other disciplines in an area where you are allowed to use a jargon that is not perfect, where you are allowed to combine your imperfect knowledge with someone else's imperfect knowledge. And maybe you don't reach the level in your career where you have, I don't know, the Nobel Prize, but still you really care at answering specific questions and answering specific answering specific doubts, let's say. I don't know if this answers your question.
No, I mean, I think you make an important point, which is that there are many kinds of scientists that do many kinds of things and make many different kinds of contributions, right? We often think of scientists as, when you were a kid, there were these like little biography books that at least they have them in the States here, right? The biography of Albert Einstein, the biography of whatever. And those are the people we think of as scientists, right? But there are many other kinds of scientists. I would agree with you. And I think creativity has so many different ways of appearing in people's work. Yeah. I'm going to thank you for that, Eleonora. Anyone else? Do you experience the supreme pleasure of finding things out? Show of hands.
I do. I think that's the best part about science is it gives you I actually had a weird answer, which is the day science part gives me the structure. It has given me the structure to understand how to think about things differently, or like what tools are available to me and how people use those tools, how people operate with those tools, which helps me understand how to like read their stories and interpret those stories that are published, right? And understand that success never really comes from one domain region being smarter than the other, let alone an individual being smart. It's really experiences. And I guess for me, part of science and night science being maybe the dawns and the dusks, if I'm going back all the way to the beginning, is like those special interactions you have with people that are surprising aha moments with someone else is for me a more pleasurable experience than even the aha moment by myself. So often I talk to math people because I always thought I was bad at math, never really learned a lot of concepts. Now that I know that, it's been incredibly helpful just for, understanding fields and understanding how we represent ourselves and how we define ourselves and why those definitions exist is a good question, I think, to kind of wonder.
Yeah. I would agree. I mean, it's yeah, thanks for sharing that. All right. Anyone else? So as we contemplate the iron rule, I guess, is there anyone who doesn't think it really exists or doesn't really work the way Strevens describes it? I'm curious. Or do we all more or less agree with him that this is certainly an important way science operates? So how do people feel about then the mixture, the ideal mixture between the iron rule, day science kind of thing, and the night science ideation? Is that where does that lie? Anybody have any thoughts? Do you have enough time for night science? Do you practice it? Do you have that sort of do you have the time and the mental space for curiosity and exploration and so on, or are you is that something that you would like more of?
I would like more like group curiosity. I feel like I have time for my own curiosity, but it's in isolation, and that gets really, I don't know how other people feel, but I get stifled after a certain point. Like I really would like to share that with somebody and have it be responded to in some way so that I could maybe the arguing comes back so I can argue with myself in peace again with some more information. But that's just my perspective.
No, thanks for saying that, Jackie. Have you had a chance to participate in a night science workshop yet, or
no, this is my first actual night science event. I've just kind of listened to the podcast for a while.
Yeah, so one of the things we do in the and sort of promote in the workshop is the idea of a night science buddy, right? So if you look at scientific, successful scientists, they very often find themselves in pairwise relationships, and there's a lot of reasons why we think it should be two people and not more, because the group dynamics are simpler. And we actually practice it in the workshop because there are certain rules that we have around. So we don't want it to be a lab meeting, right? It's not about yes butting people, right? It's about or no butting people. It's about yes and, right? It's about improv. It's about making the other person feel good. So we have all these rules, and if you have a successful sort of night science buddy relationship, you get a great benefit of ideation and free flow of ideas and things like that. And actually, one of the things we're working on at the Night Science Institute is trying to develop a matchmaking service for night science buddies. So sneak preview here in this book club. You heard it first. There will be no swiping left or right. It will be psychometric matching, and we're working on that. I don't know. I have no timeline to tell you, but yeah, we think it's really important because, as you say, Jackie, doing it by yourself can be can be stifling, and doing it with one other person can be really fun.
Maybe I wanted to add one thing to the switch between night and day science. I find it actually the most difficult part to allow yourself to switch between two things during the process, especially maybe in the beginning of scientific projects. That's actually when you have the most freedom to do the night science, to come up with this big question. But as soon as you devoted more resources to the project and you start to have some discovery, sometimes it's very difficult to allow yourself to this freedom to actually zoom out and like be very brave in rejecting some stuff from what you know, like already invested into to totally change the direction. For instance, sometimes it's also about the lack of resources or the fact that you are a human being which has to provide something in the end. And I think that's when we start to be restricted by the fact that you are also evaluated by what you generate, no? And then it's coming to the fact that we are in a publication bias, no? Like you have to be judged by something. And I think that's when it's very difficult sometimes to allow yourself to really be in this creative process. And I think, yeah, that's maybe my point of view.
Yeah, Alexandra, thanks for sharing that. I can only agree 100%, right? We've made science into much of a business, right? And you know, you have all kinds of metrics and all these other things, and then resources. Science has become very expensive, right? Yeah. For many of us. Yeah, these are real world constraints. All right, so next time we meet in November, if you join us again, please do. We're going to talk a little bit about the weaknesses of the iron rule concept. So beyond the empiricism, objectivity, observation, irrationality, and the allure of beauty, which we are subject to. So the idea is that although we try to apply, maybe some of us, many of us, try to apply the iron rule in the way that Strevens would approve of, he points out that it's actually really hard to do. And Alexander, you just mentioned some of the reasons why that's the case. And then you also pointed out that once you're stuck in a project or you're on a pathway, it's very hard to just sort of blow it up and do something completely different. So thank you all very much for joining. Please send me any feedback you have. You can get my contact information from this QR code or just oliver@nightscience.org. And I appreciate you joining, and I'll post this to our YouTube channel and look forward to seeing you all next time. One of the things you might want to let me know is if there's a book you'd like to do in our next cycle, maybe in the spring. If there's a particular book that you're reading that you think would be good, and for this book club, and maybe you even want to lead the book club on that book. Maybe you're so passionate about it. Okay, this is for the community. The idea is not that this is something I do all the time. So. Anyway, thanks again. I wish you all success in the meantime in your science and your studies, your experiments, and see you all soon.
Thank you, Oliver.
Thanks, Oliver.
Thank you.